Good day to everyone. So, to start off the discussion, it will be all about the self from various perspectives. And to start off, we will be discussing about the philosophical views of the self. And for our objective, at the end of this discussion, the student is expected to articulate the various philosophical views about the self, examine one's thoughts and experiences according to the philosophical views of the self, and propose an answer to the question, Who am I? So, what philosophy says about self? So, many thinkers have struggled to comprehend the purpose or the meaning of human life, and they have made an enormous effort to respond to the query, Who am I? And the majority of their viewpoint have shaped how we currently view our lives today. We will go back to understand the different perspectives and views of self by revisiting the views of major philosophers from ancient time and identify the most important inferences they contributed. To start off, we have to differentiate between two types of thinking. We have the rationalism and empiricism. If we are talking about rationalism, the primary and the most superior source of knowledge about reality for them is reason. And according to them, the sense experience is unreliable and inadequate truth to knowledge. And that the fundamental truth about the world can be known as priori, either innate or self evident to our mind. And if we will be talking about empiricism, according to them, the only source of genuine knowledge about the world is sense experience. Reason is an unreliable and inadequate route to knowledge unless it is grounded in the solid bedrock of sense experience. Also, for them, there is no such thing as innate knowledge because knowledge is derived from experience. The mind before experience is tabula rasa. So we'll be starting off with a discussion with the classical antiquity philosophers. And we'll start with Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. According to Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. Hence, a life that is duty bound to develop self knowledge and a life dignified with values and integrity. Living a good life means having the wisdom to distinguish what is right from wrong. Therefore, according to Socrates, only in the recognition of one's ignorance that a person can truly know oneself. The dictum, Know thyself, is an ancient greeting of a highly civilized Greek as they entered the holy sanctuary during their time. The greetings may initially appear to be purely epistemic. However, knowing oneself solely involves knowing measurable data about oneself, such as age, height, and so forth. But philosophers emphasize that knowing oneself goes beyond simply learning the fundamentals. Highly noted for his view of self, he is considered man from the point of view of his inner life. Knowing thyself tells each man to bring his inner self to light. The expression know thyself is interchangeably translated to self control. To know thyself is first an imperative, then a requirement. It is said to be imperative because you have to know the limit of the self so that one knows what is capable of doing and what is not. Then it becomes a requirement for self moderation, prudence, good judgment, and excellence of the soul. Therefore, knowing thyself is very important because it will bring the person to the excellence of the soul. So now we move on to Plato. Influenced by Socrates, Plato proposed his own philosophy of the self. He started on the examination of the self as a unique experiences. So the experience will eventually better understand the core of the self, which he called psyche. So by the way, Plato is one of the prize student of Socrates. Plato is said that self is fundamentally an intellectual entity whose nature exists independently from the physical world. He wrote a book entitled Phaedrus. Phaedrus is the most popular text for many decades in the subject of philosophy, and its main idea is that the truth can be distinguished in two forms: the metaphysical realm or the mind, and the physical world or the body. He divided the truth or the reality into two: ontos, meaning ideal, and phenomena. Ontos is the ultimate reality which tends to be permanent and spiritual, while phenomena refers to the manifestation of ideal. Compared to ontos, phenomena is imperfect, impermanent, and inferior. Plato started on the examination of the self as a unique experience. So the experience will eventually better understand the core of the self, which he then called psyche. For him, the psyche is composed of three elements: appetitive, spirited, and the mind. Appetitive includes one's desire, pleasure, physical satisfaction, comfort, etc. While spirited is part of the psyche that is excited when given challenges, or fights back when agitated, or fights for justice when unjust practices are evident. So it is said that it is the hot-blooded part of the psyche. And the mind is the most superior part of the psyche, and he referred to this element as the nous, which means the conscious awareness of the self. So it is the superpower that controls the affair of the self. It decides, analyzes, thinks ahead, proposes what is the best, and rationally controls both the appetitive and the spirited element of the psyche. Hence, in order to have a good life, one has to develop the nous and fill it with the understanding of the self and the correct ethical standards. So now we proceed to Aristotle. While Plato emphasizes the separation of the ideal and the phenomenal existence or being, he suggested that the ideal is included in the phenomena, and he called ideal essence and phenomena matter. Aristotle emphasized that the ideal or the essence and the phenomena or the matter needs to coexist and are codependent. The essence provides meaning and purpose to the matter, and the matter provides substance and solidity to the essence. Now we move on to the Middle Age philosophers. For the Middle Age philosophers, we have Saint Augustine. This is another concrete example of a highly self-controlled nous, which is the life of Saint Augustine. He gave in to wickedness and the desires of this world until he restlessly searched for the meaning of his life. The development of self for him is achieved through self-presentation and self-realization. His realization of the wasted self is achieved through his conversion to the faith, centered on his religious convictions and belief. For him, he believes that man and goal is happiness. Only in God can man attain true and eternal happiness. Human beings alone, without God, are bound to fail. So, in his confession, he pronounced, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it find rest in you." For him, as I've said earlier, man and goal is happiness. Only in God can man attain true and eternal happiness. And it is made possible in his contemplation of the truth and the divine wisdom, the God himself. So now we move on to the Renaissance philosopher. For the Renaissance philosopher, we will be discussing about Rene Descartes, Jean Locke, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant. So now we start with Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. He started his quest of discovering the self by his methodic doubt. He claimed that we cannot really rely on our senses because our sense perception can often deceive us. Everything must be subjected to doubt. There will never be certain in this world as long as it passes our senses. He said, "Cogito ergo sum," which is translated as "I think, therefore I am," or "I doubt, therefore I exist." Only after the certitude of the doubting I can all other existence become certain. And the primary condition, therefore, of the existence of the self is human rationality, meaning we need reason in order to evaluate our thoughts and action. So, contrary to the primacy of reason as proposed by Descartes, one British philosopher and politician named John Locke suggested another way of looking at the self. He opposed the idea that only reason is the source of knowledge of the self. He believed that the self is comparable to an empty space where everyday experiences contribute to the life of knowledge that is put forth in that empty space. Experience, therefore, is an important requirement in order to have sense data, which, through the process of reflection and analysis, eventually becomes sense perception. Sense perception becomes possible when all these qualities are put together in the faculty of the mind. It has to be noted that the sense perception is very subjective and that perception is changing from one individual to another. And this provides the most lenient leeway for every individual to be independent in self-examination, self-management, and self-control. For Jean Locke, individual person is not only capable of learning from experience, but also skillful enough to process different perceptions from various experiences to form a more complex um, idea. And this idea then became key to understand complex realities about the self and the world. So now we proceed to David Hume. Challenging the position of John Locke, David Hume, which is a Scottish philosopher and a historian, claimed that there cannot be a persisting idea of the self. He agreed that all ideas are derived from impression. However, impressions are subjective, temporary, and provisional, prejudicial, and even screwed, therefore cannot be persisting. Inasmuch as we wanted to be persistent, constant, and stable with our knowledge about ourselves, Hume asserted that this is just impossible. So, as long as we only derive our knowledge from sense impressions, there will never be the self. This means that for you, all we know about ourselves are just bundles of temporary impressions. Hence, difficult to answer the question, who am I? Because what we can readily answer are impressions such as hair color, achievement, and so on. And all of these are temporary and non persisting. Therefore, he claimed that there is no self. So now we proceed to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant synthesized the rationalist view of Descartes and the empiricist view of Locke and Hume. For him, self is always transcendental, and he called his philosophy the transcendental unity of a perception. For him, ideas are perceived by the self, and they are connecting the self and the world. The similarity of ideas between individuals is made possible because of him. We all have the sensory apparatus by which we derive our ideas. This means that we need not reject our ideas no matter how temporary and non persistent they are, because there is unity in ideas. Therefore, our rationality unifies and makes sense the perception we have in our experiences and makes sensible ideas about ourselves and the world. So now we proceed to the modern philosophers. For modern philosophers, we have Sigmund Freud, Gilbert Ryle, Patricia Churchland, and Maurice-Merleau-Ponty. So we will be starting off with Sigmund Freud. While Immanuel Kant established the unity of the self, Sigmund Freud insisted on the complexity of the self. For him, the I will never be the same and it will continue to change over time. According to him, there are three levels of human functioning. We have the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Sigmund Freud divided the I into conscious and unconscious. Clearly, the self for Freud will never be arbitrary, taken as a unified whole. There will always be fragments and discontinuity in the struggle inside the same I. He believed in the intimacy of the self, and he sees I as the product of multiple interacting processes, systems, and schema. And to demonstrate, he proposed two models, the topographical model and the structural model. The topographical model, wherein the individual person may both know and do not know certain things at the same time. While the structural model, according to Freud, is presented the self in three different agencies. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id acts based on instinct. It is known as the primitive and instinctive component of the self, while ego is the part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. And then we have the superego. The superego synthesizes the moral values and the system into society in order to function as the control outpost of the instinctive desires of the id. We often equate ego as the self or the I. However, Freud does not approve this logic because while the three are agencies distinct from one another, oftentimes the ego is not able to control the instinct of the id and cannot even manipulate the thoughts of the superego. And this leaves the ego as only marginal and impotent agency of the mind, not the ideal philosophical self or the soul that we wanted to figure out. Freud remarked that it is the id that is the core of our being. Now we proceed to Gilbert Ryle. In an attempt to offer an explanation to some behavior that are difficult to justify by reason, Gilbert Ryle, a British philosopher who proposed his positive view in his concept of the mind. He critiqued Descartes' dualism of the mind and body. He said, "The thinking I will never be found because it is just a ghost in the machine." He said that the mind is never separate from the body. He proposed that the physical action or the behavior are dispositions of the self, and that these dispositions are derived from our inner private experiences. Therefore, we will only be able to understand the self based from the external manifestations, which are behaviors, expressions, language, and desires. The mind, therefore, are nothing but dispositions of the self. So now we proceed with Patricia and Paul Churchland. Bringing the argument further, Patricia and Paul promoted the position called eliminative materialism, which brings forth neuroscience into the uh, core of understanding the self, that will enlighten us by the explanation of how our brain works. So, interestingly, Maurice-Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher, while his philosophy draws heavily from the contemporary research, Gestalt psychology, and neurology, he developed a kind of phenomenological rhythm that will explain the perceptions of the self. And the rhythm involves three dimensions: empiricist, idealist, and the synthesis of both positions. Empiricist, through experimentation and research, it eliminates the indeterminate complexities of experience that may have an effect on perception. Idealist, intellectual alternative, because it will only falsify perception based from one's biases and prejudices. Third, the synthesis of both positions. He believed that perception is causal process, which simply means that our perceptions are caused by the intricate experience of the self and processed intellectually while distinguishing truthful perceptions from illusionary. Therefore, the self is taken as the phenomenon of the whole, which is the Gestalt understanding of the perceptual synthesis. To summarize this discussion, we could say that during the ancient time, philosophers have identified the self according to their contextual understanding of the world. They have identified the self as the perfection of the soul. And to achieve this requires self-examination and self-control. So, compared to the modern times, or during the Renaissance or contemporary period, philosophers define self according to the personal and historical context. And they have incorporated science to their theories in the light of the technological advancement that they have been exposed to. Okay, so that concludes the discussion relating to the philosophical view of the self. Thank you for listening and see you on the next discussion. Thank you.